In the hushed, lamplight gloom of a Parisian archive, a historian's finger traces a line down a brittle, yellowing page. It is a death record from the year 1792. The name is forgotten, the dates are faded, but the listed cause of death remains stark and clear, written in a frantic, ink-splattered hand, Père. How does a society reach a point where dread itself is recorded as a fatal illness? What silent, creeping sickness of the spirit can stop a human heart more surely than any plague? This is the hidden entry point to our story, not through grand battlefields or sweeping edicts, but through the private, trembling terror of ordinary souls. We are about to slip into the bloodstream of a nation experiencing a violent, collective fever. This is the story of the French Revolution. It begins not with an explosion, but with a deep, subterranean rumble, a pressure building over decades beneath the surface of glittering calm. It is a story of a world so rigid, so unequal, that its very foundations were destined to fracture. Tonight, with Sleepy Owl, we will travel back to that precarious edge. We will wander through palaces where gold leaf covered rotten wood, and through muddy villages where hope had long since starved. We will witness the brilliant, dangerous birth of new ideas, and the devastating chaos they unleashed when they met the hard stone of reality. I am truly glad you've chosen to rest with me for this. Wherever you are in the world, whatever the hour on your clock, I wish you a profound and peaceful sleep. Let the tides of history wash away the tensions of today. If this quiet journey brings you comfort, I gently encourage you to follow the channel. It means more than you know. And feel welcome to share your own corner of the globe in the comments below. It's a lovely thing to feel connected across distance and time as we step into the past. Our journey opens on a landscape that appeared, to those living within it, as permanent as the mountains and as ordained by heaven as the stars. This was France in the closing days of the Ancien Regime, the Old Order. A society carved, layer by layer, over 1,000 years, like geological strata of tradition, faith, and unshakable hierarchy. Imagine, if you will, a great stone pyramid. At its absolute peak, in the realm of theory and belief, sat God. Just below, his divinely appointed representative on earth, the King of France. And from that sacred point downward, every person, every family, every profession had its pre-assigned place, its fixed altitude in the social atmosphere. The very air was thick with the presumption that this was the natural, the only way for human beings to coexist. This pyramid was codified into 3 monolithic blocks, known as the estates. The first estate was the clergy. From the poor, weary priest in a windswept village, offering last rites to a shepherd, to the magnificent cardinal in line, controlling vast lands and moving through court with silent, powerful grace, they formed the spiritual spine of the kingdom. But the church was far more than a conduit for prayer. It was a sovereign entity within the state, owning a staggering portion of the nation's soil, 1 fertile acre in every 10. It collected its own taxes from the poor, shaped every major life event, and held the keys to education, morality, and eternal salvation. To doubt its role was to question the cosmic architecture. Beneath them, forming the second estate, was the nobility. These were the descendants of medieval warriors, their identity forged in the memory of lance and shield, their power rooted in the possession of land. They were the marquises, the counts, the barons, living in ancestral chateaux and believing leadership was their blood right. Their privileges were a tapestry of ancient laws. They were exempt from the heaviest taxes, a tradition born from the notion that they paid their share in blood and valor on the battlefield. They commanded the army, held the highest judicial posts, and enjoyed a web of seigneurial rights over those who worked their fields, the right to hunt over a peasant's crops, to demand days of free labor, to charge for the use of the manor's mill. While some country nobles were little better off than prosperous farmers, clinging to a name, the great courtiers lived in a whirlwind of silks, perfumes, and breathtaking extravagance. And then, supporting the entire immense weight of this structure, was the third estate. This was not a class, but a category, a vast sea of humanity comprising 97 out of every 100 French souls. In its waves swam the wealthy merchant of Marseille, the ambitious lawyer in his Parisian office, the blacksmith, the baker, the candlestick maker in bustling, noisy streets. And most numerous of all, the millions upon millions of peasants, their lives a cycle of sowing and reaping, their horizons bounded by the lord's forest and the tax collector's ledger. The third estate was the French economy. They plowed the fields, stitched the garments, forged the tools, and conducted the trade. And crucially, they paid nearly every bill. The salt tax, the church tithe, the brutal taille land tax, from which the first two estates were shielded, all landed on their shoulders. They carried the financial weight of the kingdom, its extravagant court, and its endless foreign wars. A famous cartoon of the time captures this injustice perfectly. A bent, aged peasant, crushed under the burden of a plump bishop and a foppish nobleman. The many were being drained to sustain the very few. The ultimate monument to this glittering, unbalanced world stood a short carriage ride from Paris, the Palace of Versailles. It was more than a royal home. It was the engine of the state, the dazzling stage for a cult of monarchy. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had built it not just for glory, but for control. He transformed restless, powerful nobles into dependent courtiers, luring them into a gilded cage of endless ritual. Life at Versailles was a complex ballet of etiquette, where a noble's entire worth could hinge on the privilege of handing the king his shirt in the morning. The great, haunting question for us now is this: how many people truly believed in this system? For generations, most accepted it as the immutable fabric of reality. The king was a father, and loyalty to him was a sacred duty, even when times were hard. But by the 1780s, the mortar holding the ancient stones together was turning to dust, and the dazzling spectacle of Versailles could no longer disguise the deep, structural cracks spreading silently through its foundations. While the nobility performed their delicate, suffocating ballet of status in the golden halls of Versailles, a quiet but relentless tremor was moving through the minds of their countrymen. This was the Age of Enlightenment, an intellectual dawn that washed over Europe in the 18th century, and its brightest light shone from Paris. This movement placed its faith not in scripture or tradition, but in a new deity, human reason. It proposed that the same logical, questioning mind that had mapped the orbits of planets could also design a better society, a more just government, a more tolerant world. Philosophers, or philosophes, turned a cool, analytical eye on institutions that had stood for a millennium. They asked dangerous, simple questions. Why should a king rule by birthright alone? Why should a single church hold the keys to truth? Foremost among these intellectual swordsmen was Voltaire, a writer of legendary wit and piercing satire. He became the scourge of what he saw as the twin tyrannies of his age, arrogant monarchy and intolerant religion. He famously championed the principle, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." His pen dripped with mockery for superstition and the often corrupt power of the established clergy. He did not necessarily preach revolution, but by making the powerful look ridiculous, he drained the reservoir of reverence that kept them in place. If Voltaire was the master critic, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the passionate prophet. A more emotional and radical thinker, Rousseau delved into the very nature of freedom and the origins of inequality. In his seminal work, The Social Contract, he proposed an idea that was political dynamite. True sovereignty, he argued, does not belong to a king. It resides in the general will of the people themselves. A ruler is not a master, but a servant of the public good. If he fails in that duty, the people have not just the right, but the responsibility to replace him. This transformed subjects into citizens, and obedience from a sacred duty into a conditional contract. His ideas resonated with those who felt stifled by the artificial layers of the old world. Another voice provided a practical blueprint. The Baron de Montesquieu, an aristocrat himself, studied governments across the globe. He admired England's system and proposed a genius mechanism to prevent tyranny, the separation of powers. By dividing authority between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, each could act as a check on the others. No single person or group could seize absolute control. This elegant concept would inspire not only French reformers, but also the founders of a new nation across the Atlantic. These were not dusty theories confined to library shelves. They were electric, dangerous, and intoxicating ideas that spread like wildfire. They were debated in the elegant salons of Paris, gathering often hosted by influential women where the brightest minds discussed philosophy over coffee. They were argued in the hundreds of new cafes, where middle-class men read pamphlets and shaped public opinion. And they were printed, mass-produced, and distributed in volumes like the monumental Encyclopedia. Edited by Denis Diderot, this work pretended to be a simple compilation of human knowledge, from agriculture to astronomy. But woven through its factual entries was a subtle, persistent critique of the existing order. It treated religious dogma with scientific detachment and implied that governments should be based on popular consent, not divine right. The authorities tried to ban it, but it was too late. It became a best-selling manual for a new way of thinking. Now, we must ask, did the peasant, bent double in a field of wheat, ponder Rousseau's general will? Likely not. But these ideas created a new language, a new set of expectations, especially for the educated members of the Third Estate, the lawyers, doctors, and journalists. They began to speak of citizenship, natural rights, and the nation. They started to see the tax exemptions of the nobility not as an ancient privilege, but as an irrational injustice. The Enlightenment did not cause the revolution, but it built the intellectual scaffold upon which the revolution would climb. It gave a generation the words to name their grievances and the vision of a world that could be built from the rubble of the old. Yet ideas alone are not enough to topple a kingdom. They require a spark, a crisis so severe it exposes the fatal flaws in the system for all to see. For France, that spark was not a philosophical debate, but a brutally practical disaster. The state was hurtling with terrifying speed toward a cliff of absolute bankruptcy. The monarchy had a spending problem of epic proportions, and the final bill was now due. A vast portion of this expenditure was, of course, Versailles itself, the endless balls, the lavish pensions for court favorites, the sheer theatrical cost of maintaining divine spectacle. And at the center of this opulence was a young queen who became, fairly or not, its living symbol, Marie Antoinette. The Austrian-born wife of King Louis XVI was seen as frivolous, foreign, and profoundly out of touch. Libelous pamphlets circulated stories of her staggering wardrobe bills, her fantastical hairstyles, her idealized peasant village built on the palace grounds where she played shepherdess with perfumed sheep. The infamous quote, "Let them eat cake," is almost certainly a myth, but the fact it was believed tells you everything about her public image. History's judgment of her is complex. A woman trapped in a gilded cage of politics, but her perceived extravagance provided a perfect, hateful focus for public anger. But the Queen's finery was a mere flicker of candlelight compared to the blazing financial ruin of war. For decades, France had fought its great rival, Britain, across the globe. The 7 Years' War ended in a costly, humiliating defeat, stripping France of its colonies. Then, in a twist of bitter irony, the French absolute monarchy made a catastrophic decision to bankroll a revolution. It spent a fortune to support the American colonists in their war for independence against the British. French ships and French gold were crucial to the American victory at Yorktown. The geopolitical win was sweet, but the financial cost was suicidal. It plunged the French treasury into an ocean of red ink, adding over 1 billion livres to a debt already at crushing levels. The monarchy had funded a war fought in the name of liberty, and in doing so, had signed its own economic death warrant. This mountain of debt might have been scaled with a fair and efficient tax system. But France's system was neither fair nor efficient. It was a chaotic, antique mess. As we know, the wealthy clergy and nobility were largely exempt from the main direct tax, the taille. The nation's greatest reservoirs of wealth were legally untouchable. So the entire burden fell on the Third Estate, and most heavily on the poorest peasants. The method of collection was salt in the wound. The government did not collect taxes itself. It sold the right to collect them to private financiers, the tax farmers, who paid the crown a lump sum and then kept everything they squeezed from the people above that amount. This created a vicious incentive for brutality, making the tax collector the most universally despised figure in the countryside. By the late 1780s, the situation was dire. Over half the state's annual revenue was spent just to pay the interest on its debt. The kingdom was borrowing new money simply to pay off old lenders. King Louis XVI, a kind but timid and indecisive man, was utterly unequipped for the crisis. He preferred locksmithing and hunting to the brutal arithmetic of state finance. His ministers all reached the same logical, yet politically explosive, conclusion: the privileged estates must finally pay their share. A minister named Calonne proposed a sweeping new land tax that would apply to all landowners, regardless of title. It was rational, modern, and utterly necessary. The nobility and clergy reacted with fury. They saw it not as a patriotic duty, but as a violent assault on their ancient identity. Using their power in the high courts, they blocked the king at every turn, selfishly guarding their privileges even as the ship of state took on water. The great historical question lingers: could a stronger king have forced this change? Louis XVI wavered. Trapped between aristocratic defiance and an empty treasury, he was finally forced to play a card his ancestors had avoided for 175 years. He summoned the Estates General, the medieval representative assembly of all three orders, to meet in May of 1789. He hoped it would rubber stamp his new taxes. He did not realize he was not calling a meeting. He was opening a door to a hurricane. The announcement was a thunderclap. After generations of silence, the voice of the nation was being summoned. For the first time since 1614, the Estates General would convene. A shockwave of excitement, a tremor of profound hope rippled across France. It felt, to many, like the first breeze of a new spring. The winter and spring of 1789 became a season of awakening. In every town, every village, elections were held to choose the deputies who would travel to Versailles to speak for each estate. This process itself was a revolutionary education. For millions, it was their first taste of politics, gathering in cold churches or town squares to debate their future. As part of this, each community was asked to draft a cahier de doléances, a notebook of grievances. These notebooks are a historian's treasure, a chorus of voices frozen in time. They tell us what France was thinking on the eve of the deluge. The cahiers from the nobles and clergy spoke, predictably, of the need for reform while carefully protecting their own ancient exemptions. They framed their privileges as a necessary shield against royal tyranny. But the notebooks of the Third Estate tell a different, more visceral story. They paint a landscape groaning under injustice. Peasants wrote of the hated salt tax, of feudal lords hunting through their ripening grain, of days of backbreaking, unpaid labor owed to the local chateau. The bourgeois lawyers and merchants wrote with passion about legal equality, a written constitution, careers open to talent, not just birth. Remarkably, reading these documents, one is struck by a powerful, almost heartbreaking, tone of loyalty. They did not call for a republic. They addressed King Louis XVI as a benevolent father, led astray by bad advisors and greedy aristocrats. They genuinely believed that if their king could only hear their true plight, he would, in his wisdom, set things right. This deep, naive faith in the monarch as a potential savior was a formidable force, but it was a faith about to be shattered on the hard rocks of political reality. For all the heartfelt grievances, the central, burning question was a dry, procedural one. Yet it held the key to everything. How would the Estates General vote? By ancient tradition, it voted by order. Each estate deliberated as a single block and cast one vote. The clergy had one vote. The nobility had one vote. The Third Estate had one vote. The outcome was preordained. The two privileged orders would vote together to protect their interests, outvoting the Third Estate 2-1. Any real reform would be strangled in its crib. The deputies of the Third Estate, mostly educated bourgeois men, saw this trap immediately. They arrived at Versailles armed with a powerful new idea. They were not just an estate, but the embodiment of the nation itself. They demanded voting by head, where each individual deputy would have a single vote. In a crucial early concession, the king had agreed to double the third, allowing them roughly 600 deputies, compared to 300 each for the clergy and nobility. If they could vote by head, and if they could win over some reform-minded priests and liberal nobles, they would command a majority. The entire early revolution hinged on this single, technical issue. The most electrifying argument for this new power came from a clergyman, the Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Size. His pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, became a sensation. It began with 3 devastating questions and answers. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. Size argued the Third Estate was the nation. The nobility, he claimed, was a parasitic class, a foreign growth that consumed without producing. The very concept of the nation was taking hold, a unified body of citizens bound by common law, not by medieval privilege. On May 5, 1789, the deputies gathered in Versailles. The opening ceremony was a calculated insult to the Third Estate. The nobles and clergy wore magnificent silks, lace, and plumed hats. The deputies of the Third were ordered to wear plain, somber black suits, the attire of minor officials. It was a public humiliation meant to remind them of their place. It backfired spectacularly, uniting them in shared resentment. After a short, uninspiring speech from the king about finances, the battle was joined. The men in black refused to conduct any business, even to verify their members' credentials, until the other 2 orders agreed to meet as a single body and vote by head. For 6 tense weeks, a political stalemate gripped Versailles. The Third Estate held firm, a brilliant strategy of passive resistance. The king dithered, the nobility fumed, and the quiet, determined men in black simply waited. The revolution had begun not with a riot, but with a stubborn, silent refusal to play by the old rules. As the deadlock stretched into June, anxiety turned to urgency. Rumors swirled that the king, pushed by conservative advisors and the queen, was planning to dissolve the Estates General by force. The deputies realized their moment was slipping away. On June 17th, emboldened by Size's logic, they took an audacious, revolutionary step. They declared themselves the National Assembly. With this act, they were no longer one of 3 medieval orders. They claimed to be the sole legitimate representative body of the entire French nation. They argued that since they represented 97% of the people, they were the people. The other estates were invited to join, not as privileged bodies, but as fellow citizens. This was a direct seizure of sovereignty from the crown. Ultimate authority, they declared, now resided with the elected representatives of the nation. This new assembly was led by remarkable figures. Alongside Size stood the imposing, charismatic Comte de Mirabeau. A nobleman by birth but elected by the Third Estate, Mirabeau was a brilliant orator with a booming voice and a face scarred by smallpox. He was a complex man of scandal and genius, a moderate who believed fiercely in a constitutional monarchy. His powerful speeches gave courage and voice to the Assembly's bold claim. The royal court was thrown into panic. Louis XVI, torn between reform and his belief in his own God-given authority, hesitated. His hardline advisors urged a crackdown. They scheduled a séance royale, a royal session where the king would dictate terms and nullify the Assembly's declaration. To prepare, the king ordered the Assembly's meeting hall closed for repairs. On the morning of June 20th, a dreary, drizzling day, the deputies arrived to find their hall locked, guarded by royal troops. A cold fear gripped them. Was this the first move of a royal coup? Their project seemed to collapse before it had truly begun. They gathered in the street, a crowd of anxious men in black. But fear turned to defiant resolve. A deputy, the physician Joseph Ignace Guillotine, whose name would later become infamous, suggested they find another venue. He knew of a nearby indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume. And so, in a solemn procession through the wet streets, the National Assembly marched to the tennis court. It was a bare, cavernous space, a world away from gilded Versailles. There was no throne, no finery, just a plain room with a high, wooden-beamed ceiling. In this humble setting, the president of the assembly, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, climbed onto a makeshift platform. He raised his hand and read a solemn oath. The deputies swore not to separate and to meet wherever circumstances required, until they had established a constitution for the kingdom on a solid foundation. One by one, the deputies came forward to sign. A great roar of "Vive le Roi" echoed in the hall, for they still believed they were saving the king from his own court. Only one man refused to sign. The tennis court oath was the revolution's first great act of collective defiance, a promise sealed not with a seal of royalty, but with the will of the people. When the king finally held his royal session 3 days later and ordered the estates to separate, Mirabeau delivered the monarchy's most famous rebuke. To the royal messenger, he thundered, "Go tell those who sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and that we shall not leave except at the point of a bayonet." Faced with this unbreakable resolve, the king backed down. He ordered the clergy and nobility to join the National Assembly. It was a stunning, peaceful victory. The representatives of the nation had faced the absolute monarch and won. Their great work of building a new France could begin. But the king had not truly surrendered. And far from the ordered debates of Versailles, in the hungry, restless streets of Paris, a much more volatile and dangerous force was stirring, about to rush onto the stage and change everything. While the National Assembly debated high principles in Versailles, a dozen miles away, the city of Paris was a simmering pot of much baser instincts, hunger and dread. The spring of 1789 had brought a disastrous harvest. Grain was scarce, and the price of bread, the staple that made up most of a worker's diet, had soared to impossible heights. A laborer might spend 90% of his wages just trying to feed his family, and often the baker's shelves were bare. This desperate hunger bred a corrosive anger. Why did the court feast while the people starved? Whispers became convictions. The aristocracy was deliberately hoarding grain to crush the spirit of the nation. This primal fear was now poisoned by political suspicion. The king had publicly accepted the National Assembly, but his actions whispered a different story. In early July, he began quietly summoning regiments of royal troops, including foreign mercenaries, to surround Paris. Soon, nearly 30,000 soldiers encircled the capital. The official reason was keeping order. No one believed it. To the people of Paris, it was a clear threat. The king was preparing to unleash his army, dissolve the assembly, and strangle their fragile hope in its cradle. The city became a tinderbox, the air crackling with the static of impending storm. The final spark fell on July 11th. The king, yielding to hardliners at court, dismissed his finance minister, Jacques Necker. Necker was a Swiss Protestant, and while his financial skills were debatable, he was wildly popular, seen as the people's man in the government, sympathetic to reform. His firing was read as a declaration of war. The royalist coup, everyone believed, was now beginning. When the news reached Paris on July 12th, the city erupted. Crowds paraded busts of Neckers salvaged from a museum, clashing with royal cavalry. Over the next 2 days, the people began to arm themselves. They raided gunsmith shops. In a crucial move, they stormed the military hospital, the Hôtel des Invalides, seizing thousands of muskets. They had weapons, but no gunpowder, and they knew where to find it. Looming over the eastern edge of the city was a grim, medieval fortress, the Bastille. By 1789, it was more symbol than prison, an expensive, outdated relic that held only 7 inmates. But in the public mind, it was the ultimate emblem of royal tyranny, a place where the king could imprison anyone forever with a secret letter. And in its cellars sat a huge store of the gunpowder Paris now craved. On the morning of July 14th, a vast crowd gathered before its gates, demanding the powder and the removal of cannons pointed at the streets. The governor, the Marquis de Launay, refused. Negotiations stretched through the morning, the crowd growing hotter, more impatient. Then, a few men scaled the walls and lowered a drawbridge. The crowd surged into the outer courtyard. The garrison opened fire. A chaotic, bloody siege began. For hours, the crowd, firing from rooftops, battled the professional soldiers in the towers. The turning point came when a contingent of the Royal French Guard, sympathetic to the people, arrived with cannons and aimed them at the Bastille's main gate. Delaunay, seeing the hopelessness, surrendered. The crowd poured in, liberated the bewildered prisoners, and seized the gunpowder. Delaunay was captured, but on the march to City Hall, the vengeful mob overwhelmed his guards, killed him, cut off his head, and paraded it through the streets on a pike. The fall of the Bastille was more than a military action. It was a symbolic earthquake. The people had toppled a monument of royal power with their own hands. That evening, when the king returned from hunting and was told of the events, he asked, "Is it a revolt?" A duke replied, "No, sire. It is a revolution." The violence had saved the National Assembly. Shocked, the king withdrew his troops and recalled Necker. The revolution was no longer a polite debate among gentlemen. It was now a popular movement, baptized in blood, and its center of gravity had irrevocably shifted to the streets of Paris. News of the Bastille's fall spread across France like wildfire, carried by breathless riders and revolutionary pamphlets. In the provinces, the king's authority, already weakened, seemed to evaporate overnight. But in the vast countryside, this news mixed with ancient grievances and wild rumors to produce a strange, terrifying phenomenon, La Grande Peur, the Great Fear. 4 weeks in late July and August, a wave of collective panic swept the nation. A powerful, baseless rumor took hold. The aristocrats, furious at their defeat, were hiring armies of bandits to burn crops and starve the people into submission. Every stranger, every dust cloud, was seen as proof of this phantom horde. Peasants armed themselves with scythes and pitchforks, guarding their villages against an enemy that never came. This defensive terror soon curdled into offensive rage. If the nobles were plotting their ruin, the peasants reasoned, they would strike first at the source of their misery, feudalism itself. Across France, bands of peasants descended on the local chateaux. Their primary target was not the lord, often fled, but the archives. They stormed the manor houses, seeking the ancient feudal charters, the dusty parchments that listed every owed chicken, every day of unpaid labor. These documents were the legal chains of their servitude. In great bonfires in the castle courtyards, they burned them. It was a wholesale, violent dismantling of the medieval system from the ground up. They reclaimed common lands, hunted in forbidden forests, and simply refused to pay their dues. This was a revolution far more radical than anything debated in Versailles, a genuine peasant war that erased centuries of obligation in smoke and flame. News of this rural anarchy horrified the National Assembly. The deputies, mostly property-owning bourgeois, were champions of order. They had to pacify the countryside and fast. On the night of August 4th, they convened in a special, dramatic session. A liberal noble, the Vicomte de Noailles, proposed a startling solution. To calm the fury, the nobility should voluntarily surrender its feudal privileges. What began as political pragmatism exploded into a frenzy of patriotic sacrifice. One after another, the greatest lords of France stood and, in emotional speeches, renounced rights their families had held for 1,000 years. The clergy gave up the tithe. Towns surrendered their special privileges. In a single, feverish, all-night session fueled by fear and idealism, the assembly dismantled the legal skeleton of the Ancien Regime. By dawn on August 5th, the old world of privilege was declared dead, abolished in its entirety. The Great Fear had forced the politician's hand, accelerating the revolution from a political dispute into a profound social transformation. With the rubble of the old order swept away in that fiery night, the assembly now faced a more delicate task, to lay the philosophical cornerstone for the new France. Before a constitution, they needed a statement of first principles, a birth certificate for their new world. The result, issued in late August 1789, was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This concise, elegant document distilled the Enlightenment's essence into 17 articles. It was a lyrical, powerful promise. Its famous first article declared, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights." It located sovereignty not in a king, but in the nation. It promised liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It proclaimed freedom of speech, of the press, of religion. It stated that law was the expression of the general will, and that all citizens were equal before it. It was a theoretical demolition of absolute monarchy and a blueprint for a liberal state. Yet, for all its universal language, it was a document of its time. Its man was implicitly a property-owning male. The rights of women, of enslaved people in the colonies, of religious minorities, were ignored. A brilliant activist, Olympe de Gouges, would soon publish a Declaration of the Rights of Woman, but it was dismissed. The revolution's lofty ideals had already revealed their limits. Nevertheless, the Declaration was a watershed. It transformed the struggle from a fiscal crisis into a universal fight for human liberty. Its words would echo in every corner of the globe for centuries to come. But as the autumn leaves fell in 1789, the people of Paris discovered that noble words could not bake bread, and their hunger and their mistrust of a hesitant king was about to pull the royal family itself into the heart of the storm. The Declaration of Rights was a beautiful promise, but promises could not quiet a growling stomach. By October 1789, Paris was once again in the clutches of a bread shortage. The harvest was in, yet flour was not reaching the city's ovens. The lines outside bakeries grew long and ugly, the mood darkening with each empty-handed return. Political suspicion, never far from the surface, boiled over. The king had still not formally approved the August decrees abolishing feudalism, nor given his royal assent to the Declaration of Rights. His hesitation looked like stubborn defiance, a silent pact with the scheming aristocrats at court. Then, a fresh insult ignited the tinder. News spread of a banquet at Versailles for the officers of the king's bodyguard. In a drunken, royalist fervor, the officers had supposedly trampled the new revolutionary cockade, the red, white, and blue ribbon, and replaced it with the white of the Bourbon monarchy. To hungry, anxious Parisians, this was the final proof. The court was not just out of touch, it was mocking them, feasting and plotting while children cried for bread. The breaking point came on the cold, rainy morning of October 5th. In the central markets, the formidable women of Paris, the fishwives and stall-keepers known for their toughness and sharp tongues, had finally had enough. Their anger over the price of bread exploded into action. One young woman seized a drum and began to march. The rhythmic beating became a magnet. Soon, thousands of women, armed with kitchen knives and rolling pins, were surging through the streets. Their demand was simple: bread. But it quickly merged with political fury. They began to shout a new demand: to Versailles. If the king lived among them in Paris, they reasoned, he could not be so easily poisoned against his people by the Austrian woman, the queen. The crowd, now a massive, muddy river of humanity, first stormed Paris's city hall, demanding arms. Then they began the long, 12-mile trek to Versailles. They were joined by thousands of men and, crucially, by members of the National Guard, whose commander, the Marquis de Lafayette, was reluctantly forced to follow to maintain some semblance of order. The scene at the palace that afternoon was one of surreal chaos. A mud-splattered, furious multitude filled the courtyards, their shouts for bread echoing off the marble facades. A delegation of women barged into the National Assembly, surrounding the terrified deputies. The assembly, overwhelmed, promised action. A group, including market women, was sent to see the king. Louis XVI, with his characteristic passive gentleness, met them and promised to release all the grain stores in Versailles to Paris. This calmed some, but the core demand remained. The king must return with them. That night, an uneasy standoff settled over the palace. Lafayette's guards took up defensive positions. The crowd, cold and wet, remained, their mood still volatile. The crisis reached its peak in the pre-dawn hours of October 6th. A small group found an unlocked gate and surged into the palace corridors. Their target was the queen's apartments, screaming for her death. Marie Antoinette, warned just in time, fled through a secret passage to the king's rooms moments before the mob burst in and hacked her bed to pieces. palace guards were killed, their heads mounted on pikes. To quell the violence, the king, on Lafayette's advice, appeared on a balcony. The crowd shouted, "To Paris! To Paris!" Then, in an act of startling courage, Marie Antoinette herself stepped onto the balcony, her children beside her. The crowd fell silent. Lafayette knelt and kissed her hand, a theatrical gesture that momentarily diffused the hatred. But the will of the people was absolute. The king had no choice. Later that day, a bizarre and solemn procession began. The National Guard led the way, carrying pikes bearing the heads of the slain guards. Then came the royal carriage, carrying the king, queen, and their children, followed by the deputies of the National Assembly. They were surrounded by a jubilant, chanting crowd of Parisian women who sang that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to Paris. The women's march had succeeded. The monarchy's power was broken. King Louis XVI was now a prisoner of his own capital, his authority subject to the volatile will of the Parisian crowd. He was installed in the Tuileries Palace, a gilded cage in the heart of the city. The age of Versailles was over. The revolution had entered a new, more unstable, and far more dangerous phase. For the next 2 years, the National Assembly, now also in Paris, worked feverishly to build the rational, new France they had promised at the tennis court. This was the moderate, bourgeois revolution at its peak. They were not wild-eyed radicals, but men of the Enlightenment, architects drawing a blueprint for a modern state, a constitutional monarchy. They swept away the ancient, tangled provinces, Brittany, Normandy, Burgundy, and divided France into 83 uniform departments, named after rivers and mountains to erase old loyalties. They created a new, unified legal system. And they tackled the root of the crisis, money. In a bold and controversial move, they nationalized the immense land holdings of the Catholic Church. This wealth was used as collateral for a new paper currency, the assignat. The plan was to sell the church lands to citizens, creating a new class of small landowners irrevocably tied to the revolution's success. The centerpiece was the Constitution of 1791. After 2 years of debate, it established a limited constitutional monarchy. The old estates were abolished. A single legislative assembly would make the laws. The king, now titled King of the French, was granted only a suspensive veto. He could delay laws, but not stop them forever. Real power lay with the elected representatives. But fear of the mob led the assembly to create a distinction between active and passive citizens. Only men over 25 who paid a certain amount in taxes, the propertied classes, could vote. Universal rights were promised, but full political power was reserved for the wealthy. The Assembly's most fateful error, however, was its attempt to redesign the human soul. In the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, 1790, they sought to make the church a department of the state. Bishops and priests would be elected by the people, including non-Catholics, and paid by the government. Every cleric was required to swear a public oath of allegiance to this new constitution. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. For devout Catholics, this was an unforgivable intrusion of the state into the realm of God. The Pope condemned it. The French clergy split, the jurors who took the oath and the non-jurors, or refractory, priests who refused. Overnight, the assembly turned millions of pious peasants, especially in regions like the Valais in western France, into enemies of the revolution. They had transformed a political struggle into a holy war. For King Louis XVI, a man of sincere faith, this was the final, unbearable betrayal. His conscience revolted. Living as a prisoner in the Tuileries, a reluctant rubber stamp for laws he despised, he saw the revolution spiraling away from the moderate reform he had once supported. Urged on by the Queen, who never shared his hesitation, he made a desperate decision. He would flee. He would escape the radical cauldron of Paris, reach the eastern border, and rally loyal troops. From a position of strength, he could then negotiate, roll back the revolution's excesses, and restore a king's true authority. It was a gamble that required perfect secrecy and flawless execution. It would have neither. The escape was set for the night of June 20, 1791. Disguised, the king as a valet, the queen as a Russian governess, the royal family slipped out of the Tuileries and boarded a large, heavy, custom-built carriage. The plan was doomed from the start. They were hours behind schedule. The king, unaccustomed to his role, kept sticking his head out the window. His face, printed on every banknote in France, was his own wanted poster. At the town of Saint Ménehould, the local postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Drouet, thought the valet's face looked familiar. He pulled out an assignat and compared the portrait. It was the king. In a feat of patriotic haste, Drouet took a shortcut to the next town, Versailles, and raised the alarm. The royal carriage arrived to find the bridge blocked and armed townsmen waiting. Confronted, Louis finally admitted, "Yes, I am your king." The flight to Versailles was a psychological and political disaster. The royal family was escorted back to Paris by a massive, silent, and hostile crowd. The image of the king as a benevolent father was shattered, replaced by that of a duplicitous coward who had tried to abandon his people. The moderate dream of a constitutional monarchy was fatally wounded. The king had tried to escape his revolution, but in his failure, he only accelerated its violent momentum toward a destination he could never have imagined: a republic and the cold, silent blade of the guillotine. The captured king's return to Paris was a funeral procession for trust. The moderate revolutionaries, men like Lafayette who had staked everything on a partnership with the crown, were left clinging to a transparent fiction, that Louis had been kidnapped. No one believed it. The radical journalists and street orators now had irrefutable proof. The monarchy was incompatible with the new France. The word republic, once a dangerous whisper, began to be spoken openly in political clubs and crowded cafes. Across Europe, the royal courts watched with mounting horror. The idea that a people could arrest their own king was a disease that threatened every throne. Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, faced pressure from exiled French nobles to intervene. In August 1791, he and the King of Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. It was a piece of diplomatic theater, a vague threat of action if the French royal family was harmed, conditional on the agreement of all other powers, which they knew was impossible. It was meant to sound tough but commit to nothing. In the paranoid atmosphere of revolutionary Paris, however, it was heard as a thunderous declaration of war. The crowned heads of Europe, it seemed, were forming a crusade to crush liberty in its cradle. The declaration, intended to intimidate, instead inflamed a passionate, defensive nationalism. In October 1791, the National Assembly, its work done, dissolved. A new legislative assembly was elected under the rules of the fresh constitution. Its members were younger, less experienced, and more ideological. They quickly split into factions. On the right sat the constitutional monarchists, struggling to preserve the now crumbling 1791 settlement. On the left grew a powerful group, many from the Gironde region, led by the eloquent Jacques-Pierre Brisset. The Girondins, as they were called, became ardent champions of a new cause, war. They believed a foreign war would purify the revolution, force the king to show his true colors, and unite the nation in a glorious, liberating crusade. "This is a crusade for universal liberty," Brisset proclaimed. It was an intoxicating vision. French armies would march to free the oppressed peoples of Europe from their tyrants. Strangely, the drive for war created a perverse alliance. The Girondins wanted war to radicalize the revolution and expose the king. The king and his court secretly wanted the same war, but for the opposite reason. They were convinced the disorganized, amateur revolutionary armies would be swiftly crushed by professional Austrian and Prussian forces. In the ensuing chaos and defeat, the people would beg for the return of strong royal authority. It was a treasonous gamble with the nation's fate. Only one significant voice rang out against the war fever: Maximilien Robespierre. Speaking at the Jacobin Club, a powerful political society, Robespierre delivered prophetic warnings. The real enemies, he argued, were within France. A war would lead to military dictatorship. "No one loves armed missionaries," he cautioned. His words were dismissed as the timidity of a man who lacked revolutionary nerve. The clamor for war was deafening. In April 1792, Louis XVI, in a surreal moment, appeared before the Legislative Assembly and, with a trembling voice, proposed a declaration of war against his own brother-in-law, the Austrian Emperor. The vote was nearly unanimous. France was now at war with the most powerful monarchies on the continent. They believed it would be a short, glorious adventure. It would become a quarter-century of slaughter that would consume them all. The war began as the king had hoped and Robespierre had feared, a disaster. French armies, their aristocratic officer corps decimated by emigration, collapsed in chaos and mutiny at their first contact with the enemy. The professional armies of Austria and Prussia, under the Duke of Brunswick, began a slow, terrifying advance into French territory. By the summer of 1792, Paris itself felt exposed, vulnerable. Panic and fury fused in the capital. The Girondins who had championed the war were now blamed for the defeats. They deflected blame by intensifying their accusations against the king, claiming he was betraying military secrets to the enemy. This suspicion was cemented in late July when the Duke of Brunswick issued a manifesto to the people of Paris. It warned that if the royal family was harmed, the Allied armies would give the city over to military execution and total destruction. The Brunswick Manifesto was a catastrophic blunder. It did not terrify Paris, it enraged it. This was final proof the king was in league with foreign invaders. The threat to destroy the city was a threat to destroy the revolution itself. On the night of August 9th, the radical sections of Paris, the working-class sans-culottes, those without knee breeches, took charge. They formed a new, insurrectionary city government, the Paris Commune. In the early hours of August 10th, a massive crowd of sans-culottes and radical National Guardsmen marched on the Tuileries Palace. This was not a spontaneous riot, it was a military assault. The palace was defended by about 900 Swiss guards. The king, seeing the armed multitude approaching, made a fateful decision. He fled with his family to the nearby Legislative Assembly, seeking protection. His departure left the Swiss in an impossible position. Fighting broke out. The Swiss, disciplined and brave, initially held the mob back. But the revolutionaries, enraged, brought cannons to bear. The palace was stormed. The Swiss guards were overwhelmed and massacred, many after they had surrendered. The Tuileries was ransacked, its symbols of royalty defiled. The storming of the Tuileries was the bloody, violent end of the French monarchy. The intimidated Legislative Assembly had no choice. They suspended the king, placed him and his family under arrest, and called for elections to a new assembly, the National Convention, to be elected by universal male suffrage. The Constitution of 1791 was dead. The monarchy was dead. A republic was now inevitable. In the power vacuum that followed, paranoia festered. With the Prussian army still advancing, radical journalists like Jean-Paul Marat screamed that the prisons were full of traitors ready to stab the revolution in the back. In early September, this fear erupted into an orgy of primitive violence. 4 days, armed mobs broke into Parisian prisons, holding sham trials, before slaughtering the inmates, priests, common criminals, aristocrats, anyone suspected of disloyalty. The September massacres, claiming over 1,000 lives, were a horrifying descent into primal, vigilante terror. Yet, from this abyss came a miracle. On September 20th, at the Battle of Valmy, a reformed French army stood its ground against the Prussian advance. As cannon smoke filled a muddy field, the French line held. The Duke of Brunswick, unnerved, ordered a retreat. It was less a military triumph than a profound psychological victory. The revolution had been saved. The very next day, September 21st, 1792, the new National Convention held its first session. Its initial, monumental act was to formally abolish the monarchy. France was declared a republic. The 1,000-year kingdom was over. A new, uncertain era had begun. And the first, grim question this newborn republic faced was this: what does a nation do with a king who is now just a man and a prisoner? The answer would stain the revolution forever and plunge all of Europe into a deeper, darker war. The First French Republic was born into a world of enemies, its infancy cradled in the sound of distant cannon fire. The victory at Valmy had provided a breath, not a cure. The new National Convention, elected to guide the Republic, was itself a battleground. Two factions faced each other across the hall. On one side sat the Girondins, now perceived as the more moderate, provincial voice of legality. On the other, occupying the higher benches that gave them the name the Mountain, sat the hardline radicals of Paris, led by the icy, principled Maximilien Robespierre and the fiery orator Georges Danton. Their power base was the Parisian sans-culottes and the Jacobin Club. The first and most divisive issue between them was the fate of the prisoner in the Temple fortress, Louis Capet, the former king. The Girondins, many of them lawyers, feared the consequences. Executing a king would unite all of Europe in vengeance and perhaps unleash uncontrollable violence at home. They argued for imprisonment, exile, or at least a national referendum. The Mountain saw it as a simple question of survival. Robespierre rejected the idea of a trial altogether. Louis cannot be judged, he stated. He is already judged. He is condemned, or the Republic is not absolved. His young ally, Louis Antoine de Saint-Just, was even more chillingly direct. This man must reign or die. The king's existence, they argued, was itself a counter-revolutionary act. Any lingering hope for mercy evaporated in November 1792. A locksmith came forward to reveal a secret safe, an armoire de fer, built into a wall of the Tuileries. Its contents were a trove of the king's private correspondence. The letters proved his secret dealings with émigré nobles, his pleas to foreign powers, his profound hostility to the revolution. The evidence of treason was now irrefutable. The trial began in December, before the convention itself. Louis, now Citizen Capet, stood calm and dignified as the charges were read, conspiring against liberty, colluding with foreign powers. He defended himself with quiet intelligence, but the outcome was never in doubt. This was political theater, not a court of law. In January 1793, the convention held a dramatic, agonizing vote. For 24 hours, deputies stood one by one to declare their verdict publicly, under the gaze of a hostile gallery. The vote on guilt was near unanimous. The vote on a popular referendum was defeated. Then came the final, terrible roll call for the penalty. The atmosphere was electric. When the tally was complete, the sentence was death. The margin was close, but clear. Among those voting for execution was the king's own cousin, Philippe Égalité, the Duke of Orleans, who had embraced the revolution. On a cold, foggy morning, January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was taken by carriage to the Place de la Révolution. He mounted the scaffold with composure, attempted to address the crowd, but a drum roll drowned out his final words. The blade of the guillotine fell. The executioner held the head aloft to a cheering crowd. The act of regicide was complete. France had killed its father king, and in doing so, had declared total war on the past. The execution was a point of no return. It horrified Europe, solidifying a vast coalition against the regicide republic. Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic joined the war. At home, it deepened every fissure, making civil war inevitable. The spring and summer of 1793 saw the Republic on the verge of being torn apart. French armies suffered defeats on every front. The economy collapsed under the weight of runaway inflation caused by printing assignats. In the deeply Catholic region of the Valais, the convention's order for a national draft sparked a massive, brutal peasant rebellion, a holy war for God and the king that became a savage internal conflict. This atmosphere of existential crisis brought the political struggle in the convention to its climax. The Girondins were blamed for the military and economic chaos. The Mountain, allied with the hungry sans-culottes who demanded price controls and harsh measures against hoarders, accused them of being secret royalists. On June 2nd, tens of thousands of armed sans-culottes and National Guardsmen surrounded the convention, their cannons trained on the building. They demanded the arrest of the leading Girondins. The convention capitulated to the armed mob. 29 Girondin deputies were purged. The Mountain and the Jacobins now held absolute power. They had won by violating the very representative government they served, a precedent that would soon haunt them. To manage the multi-front war, the convention had already created an emergency executive body, the Committee of Public Safety. Initially a war cabinet, it now became the all-powerful de facto government of France. Meeting in a green-walled room in the Tuileries, its 12 members controlled the army, the bureaucracy, and the terror. In July, Robespierre joined the committee, becoming its most dominant voice. His unwavering belief in revolutionary virtue gave the coming darkness a moralistic fervor. Faced with invasion, civil war, and economic collapse, the committee concluded that only the most extreme measures could save the Republic. In September 1793, bowing to sans-culotte pressure, the convention made a fateful declaration: terror is the order of the day. The reign of terror had officially begun. Its logic was grimly paradoxical. To create a republic of virtue, a society of honest, selfless citizens, they first had to purge the nation of all that was corrupt and counter-revolutionary. Terror, in Robespierre's view, was an emanation of virtue, the swift, surgical justice of a people saving themselves. It was emergency medicine for the body politic, however brutal the surgery. The instrument of this surgery was the Law of Suspects, September 1793. It created a breathtakingly broad definition of an enemy, anyone who by their conduct, relations, or speech showed themselves to be opposed to liberty. It was a law that made suspicion itself a crime. To try these suspects, the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris and similar courts nationwide were empowered. These were not courts of justice, but engines of political annihilation. Proceedings were swift, rights of the accused were minimal, and the verdicts were binary: acquittal or death. And the mechanism of death was a machine. The guillotine, originally designed as a humane, egalitarian form of execution, now became the relentless, mechanical heart of the terror. Its daily rhythm in the Place de la Révolution became the terrifying pulse of the revolution itself. The world's first modern ideological state, armed with a legal framework for persecution and a factory for death, was now fully operational. The revolution had begun to devour its own children, and would soon turn its hungry gaze upon its parents. To be caught in the web of the terror was a swift and arbitrary nightmare. It often began with a whisper, a denunciation from a neighbor, a rival, a stranger bearing a grudge. Local surveillance committees, staffed by zealous patriots, would decide a person's fate on such flimsy evidence. Arrests came in the dead of night. Prisons like the conciergerie overflowed, becoming grim waiting rooms for the scaffold. Trials before the Revolutionary Tribunal were a cruel parody of justice. The public prosecutor, the ruthless Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, presented the state's flimsy case. The accused had little time to mount a defense. Witnesses were rarely called. The judges saw themselves not as impartial arbiters, but as surgeons cutting out infection. The verdict was almost always preordained. From the tribunal, the condemned were loaded onto open carts, the tumbrils, for their final journey through Paris. Crowds jeered. A group of women known as the tricoteuses famously knitted at the foot of the guillotine, counting the heads as they fell. The terror consumed people from all walks of life, a great leveler in death. Its most famous victim was the former queen. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was put on trial. The charges were lurid and largely fabricated, including the monstrous accusation of abusing her own son. She faced them with a gaunt, dignified calm. Her execution followed soon after, a stark end to a life of extraordinary privilege and profound tragedy. The revolution began to feast on its own creators. The purged Girondin leaders were executed in a single batch. As they went to the scaffold one by one, they reportedly sang the Martyrs, their chorus growing fainter until the last voice was silenced. The feminist writer Olympe de Gouges, who had dared to publish a Declaration of the Rights of Women, was guillotined for her political moderate. Madame Roland, the brilliant hostess of a Girondin salon, uttered the famous last words as she faced the blade, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" The violence was not confined to Paris. In fact, its most horrific episodes unfolded in the provinces, where the government sought to crush rebellion with exemplary brutality. The city of Lyon, which had risen against Jacobin rule, was made a terrifying example. The convention decreed, "Lyon is no more." Its very name was to be erased. The guillotine was deemed too slow. Instead, hundreds of prisoners were tied together and mowed down by cannon fire in fields, the infamous mitraillettes. In Nantes, a representative named Jean-Baptiste Carrier sought to drown the Vaudey rebellion in literal terms. Thousands of prisoners, priests, nuns, suspects, were loaded onto barges, taken to the middle of the Loire River, and sunk. These noyades, or mass drownings, became a symbol of the terror's descent into depraved, industrialized murder. By the spring of 1794, the Reign of Terror had achieved its grim purpose. The French armies, revitalized by the draft and a total war economy, were victorious on the frontiers. The Vaudey rebellion was crushed. The Republic was saved from immediate destruction. Yet, the machinery of death, once set in motion, only accelerated. The emergency had passed, but the terror had developed its own logic and momentum. And the victorious Jacobin government, having destroyed its external and internal enemies, now began to fracture from within, splintering into factions that would turn the terror inward for one final, bloody act. Three powerful groups now vied for control. On the far left were the Hébertists, radical atheists led by the journalist Jacques Hébert. They pushed for extreme de-Christianization, a war against all wealth, and an intensification of the terror. On the other side, a faction of indulgence formed around Georges Danton. Weary of bloodshed, Danton and his allies, like the journalist Camille Delin, began to call for clemency and a return to normalcy. "I would rather be guillotined than guillotine others," Danton declared, a direct challenge to the ruling ideology. Caught in the middle was Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre despised the chaotic, atheistic Hébertists as a threat to his orderly republic of virtue. But he also saw the Dantonists' call for mercy as a dangerous weakness, a corruption that would allow enemies to regroup. To secure his vision, he decided he must destroy both. He struck left first. In March 1794, Hébert and his key followers were arrested, given a swift show trial, and guillotined. With this, Robespierre broke the power of the militant sans-culottes. Then, just weeks later, he turned on the right. Danton, Desmoulins, and their circle were arrested on charges of corruption and conspiracy. Danton's trial was a dramatic farce. The great orator fought for his life with all his eloquence, but the verdict was never in doubt. On the way to the scaffold, he reportedly told the executioner, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." His final words were a prophecy for Robespierre, "You will follow me." With his rivals eliminated, Robespierre stood alone at the pinnacle of power, but his position was dangerously isolated. He had silenced the popular voice of the streets and executed the revolution's most beloved figures. His power now rested solely on fear. In this eerie silence, Robespierre attempted to impose his moral vision. A deist who detested both Catholicism and atheism, he established a new state religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. On June 8, 1794, he presided over its festival in Paris, dressed in a sky-blue coat, acting as high priest. To many deputies, this messianic performance was not inspiring, but deeply unsettling, the prelude to a personal dictatorship. 2 days later, he pushed through the law of 22 Prairial. This law accelerated the terror to a horrifying new speed. It stripped the accused of all right to a legal defense and allowed convictions based on the moral conviction of the jurors. The result was the Great Terror. In the 7 weeks before the law, the Paris guillotine claimed about 500 victims. In the 7 weeks after, it consumed over 1,300. The bloodletting became frantic, indiscriminate. But the terror was now consuming itself. The purges had sown a universal paranoia within the government. Every deputy in the convention who had watched Danton and Hébert die now wondered if he would be next. Robespierre, increasingly withdrawn and paranoid, made his fatal error. On July 26, 8 Thermidor, he gave a vague, rambling speech to the convention warning of a new conspiracy, but refused to name the traitors. This unspecified threat was the last straw. Every deputy feared his own name was on that secret list. The next day, 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, when Robespierre rose to speak, he was shouted down. A chorus of deputies yelled, "Down with the tyrant!" In a sudden, dramatic reversal, the convention voted for the arrest of Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, and their closest allies. The Paris Commune freed them briefly, but the Sans-Culottes did not rise to their defense. Their spirit had been broken. In the early hours of July 28th, troops loyal to the convention stormed the city hall. Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered by a pistol shot. Whether self-inflicted or from a guard is unknown. That afternoon, without trial, the architect of the terror and 21 of his followers were guillotined. The blade that had been his great instrument fell on his own neck. The fall of Robespierre on 9 Thermidor did not mark an end to revolution, but a dramatic, convulsive reversal. The men who overthrew him, the Thermidorians, were not royalists or moderates. They were fellow Jacobins, former terrorists who had acted out of sheer self-preservation. Yet the wave of public disgust and exhaustion that followed was so powerful it swept them into a new era, the Thermidorian reaction. France, drained by the relentless demands of virtue and saturated in blood, now swung with violent momentum toward the opposite extreme. The first task was dismantling the machinery of fear. The law of 22 Prairial was repealed. The Revolutionary Tribunal was stripped of power. The Great Committee of Public Safety was reduced to a mere administrative panel. The prison gates swung open, releasing thousands of suspects who had been awaiting their turn in the tumbrils. The Jacobin Club, the fervent heart of the terror, was shut down. It was a wholesale repudiation of the Robespierrist state. This political shift unleashed a dramatic cultural explosion. The austere, puritanical republic of virtue vanished overnight, replaced by a frenetic, desperate pursuit of pleasure. A new youth culture emerged, the jeunesse dorée, gilded youth. These were young men from wealthy families who dressed in exaggerated, foppish styles, with high collars and carefully tousled hair. They roamed Paris armed with heavy clubs, hunting down and beating remaining Jacobins, tearing the red liberty caps from public buildings. Theaters reopened with frivolous, scandalous plays. Lavish balls were held, the most infamous being the bals de victims, balls of the victims. To gain entry, one had to have lost a relative to the guillotine. Attendees wore thin red ribbons around their necks, a macabre fashion statement mimicking the blade's cut. It was a society emerging from collective trauma, dancing on a grave to forget the nightmare. This reaction had a much darker, violent side. In the provinces, a white terror broke out. Royalists and families of those who had perished now hunted down and murdered former Jacobin officials and local terrorists in a bloody cycle of revenge. While the rich celebrated, the poor starved. The Thermidorian government, dominated by the propertied bourgeoisie, swiftly abolished the economic controls of the Jacobin era. The maximum, the price controls on bread and essentials, was ended. The result was catastrophic. The assignat currency plummeted to near worthlessness. Inflation spiraled. A terrible winter in 1794 to 95 brought famine conditions worse than 1789. Once again, the cry for bread echoed through Parisian slums. In the spring of 1795, the Sans-Culottes made one last, desperate uprising. In the Prairial uprising, they stormed the convention, demanding bread and the Constitution of 1793. The radical, democratic Jacobin constitution that had been drafted but never implemented. They even killed a deputy, parading his head on a pike through the hall. But this time, there were no sympathetic Jacobins in power. The convention called in the army, which used overwhelming force to crush the revolt. The working-class districts were surrounded and disarmed. The Prairial uprising was the final, definitive defeat of the Parisian mob. The popular energy that had driven the revolution since the Bastille was broken. Having secured power against both the Jacobin left and the Parisian crowd, the Thermidorians set about building a stable, bourgeois republic designed to prevent a return to either royal tyranny or radical democracy. The result was the Constitution of the Year 3, 1795. It was a deeply conservative document. Power was placed firmly back in the hands of property owners through a complex, indirect voting system that disenfranchised the poor. To prevent another Robespierre, executive power was fragmented and weakened, given to a 5-man committee called the Directory. The legislature was split into 2 houses, a lower council of 500 to propose laws, and an upper council of ancients to approve them. It was a system of checks and balances designed for paralysis, born from a fear of strong authority. The new constitution was immediately challenged, not from the left, but from the right. Parisian royalists, smelling weakness, believed they could restore the monarchy. In October 1795, 13 Vendémiaire, a large royalist mob marched on the Tuileries, aiming to overthrow the convention before the new government could take power. The defense of the convention was entrusted to a young, relatively unknown artillery general who happened to be in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte. With ruthless efficiency, Napoleon lined up his cannons to sweep the narrow streets leading to the palace. When the royalist columns advanced, he dispersed them with what he later called a whiff of grape shot. The uprising was crushed in minutes. The event was a crucial turning point. It saved the new Directory, but it proved that the government's power rested not on popular will, but on the bayonets of the army. And it brought the ambitious, ice-cool young general who had saved it to the attention of France's new masters. The Directory that took power in 1795 was a government of survivors, men who had navigated the terror and emerged cynical and weary. Their main goal was to hold the dangerous center, preventing a Jacobin revival on the left and a royalist restoration on the right. The result was 4 years of chronic instability, corruption, and political intrigue. The government was perpetually bankrupt, propped up by a series of mini-coups that relied on military intervention. This weak, unpopular regime, born from exhaustion, created the perfect vacuum for the rise of an extraordinary individual. That individual was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not a product of old France. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, a year after it became French. An outsider, he spoke French with an Italian accent and was mocked at military school. The revolution was his making. The flight of aristocratic officers opened a path for talent. A brilliant student of artillery, his first moment of fame came at the siege of Toulon in 1793, where his cunning gun placements drove out the British fleet. He was promoted to general at 24. His decisive crushing of the royalist uprising in 1795 made him a hero to the new regime. The directors, wary of his ambition, were happy to send him far away. In 1796, they gave him command of the ragged, underfed army of Italy. It was considered a sideshow. For Napoleon, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He arrived and electrified his despondent troops with the famous promise, "Soldiers, you are naked, poorly fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains on earth. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." What followed was a lightning campaign that stunned Europe. Abandoning slow, traditional warfare, Napoleon moved his armies with incredible speed, concentrating force to destroy Austrian and Piedmontese armies piece by piece. He inspired fierce loyalty, knowing his soldiers by name. In a whirlwind of victories, Lodi, Castiglione, Rivoli, he conquered northern Italy. He acted as a sovereign, creating sister republics, levying huge financial indemnities, and systematically looting Italy's greatest art treasures for the Louvre in Paris. He returned to France in 1797 a conquering hero, his popularity dwarfing that of the feeble directors. Once again, they wanted him gone. He proposed an even more grandiose scheme, an invasion of Egypt, to strike at British trade routes to India. The Directory agreed, delighted to send their brilliant, troublesome general to the far side of the Mediterranean. In 1798, Napoleon captured Malta and then Egypt, defeating the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids. But his campaign was doomed when the British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon had conquered Egypt, but he and his army were now stranded, cut off from France. His eastern dream had become a splendid trap. Yet, as he languished in the desert, the government he had left behind was collapsing once more, setting the stage for his most audacious move yet, not on a battlefield, but in the heart of Paris itself. While Napoleon was marooned in Egypt, conducting archaeological surveys and feudal campaigns in the Syrian desert, the Directory in France was unraveling. By 1799, it was widely seen as corrupt, incompetent, and bankrupt. A new coalition of European powers had formed against France, winning victories and threatening invasion. At home, political instability was constant. The nation was weary, exhausted by a decade of chaos, yearning for order, stability, and an end to the revolution's pendulum swing between anarchy and terror. Within the government itself, a conspiracy was brewing. A powerful group, including the former revolutionary theorist Abbé Sieyès, now one of the 5 directors, believed the Directory's weak, fragmented system was doomed. They decided a coup was necessary to establish a stronger, more authoritarian executive. Sieyès had drafted a new constitution, but he needed a sword, a popular general with an army to enforce their will. As if on cue, news arrived that seemed miraculous. Napoleon Bonaparte had landed in France. Having secretly abandoned his army in Egypt, he evaded the British Navy and arrived on the southern coast in October 1799. The failure of his Egyptian campaign was forgotten. He was hailed as the returning hero, the nation's potential savior. His journey to Paris was a triumphal procession. The conspirators quickly approached him. An alliance was forged between the ambitious general and the scheming politician. Together, they plotted the overthrow of the very government Napoleon was sworn to protect. The date was set, 18 Brumaire, year 8, November 9, 1799. The coup began smoothly. The Council of Ancients, where the conspirators had influence, was convened on a false alarm of a Jacobin plot. In the manufactured panic, they voted to move both legislative councils to the Palace of St. Cloud outside Paris for their safety and appointed General Bonaparte as commander of troops in the capital to protect them. The first phase was a success. The next day, 19 Brumaire, the plan frayed. The deputies, gathered at St. Cloud, grew suspicious. Napoleon, a master of battlefields but a novice in parliamentary politics, made a critical error. He entered the chamber of the Council of Ancients and gave a nervous, garbled speech that was met with skepticism. Then he entered the more hostile Council of 500. As soon as he appeared, deputies surrounded him, shouting, "Down with the dictator," and "Outlaw him." They jostled him, grabbing his coat. The great general, facing bayonets without flinching, was overwhelmed by this verbal and physical assault. He was pushed and pale, nearly fainting, and had to be dragged from the hall by his grenadiers. The coup was on the brink of collapse. The deputies were about to vote to declare Napoleon an outlaw, which would mean his arrest and execution. Salvation came from his younger brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who happened to be the president of the council. Lucien rushed out to the courtyard where the troops were waiting. He mounted a horse, drew his sword, and lied brilliantly. He told the soldiers that a majority of the council was being terrorized by a handful of deputies armed with daggers, in the pay of England, who had just tried to assassinate their general. Pointing his sword at Napoleon, he swore he would stab his own brother if he ever betrayed the Republic. This theatrical lie was the final push. The soldiers, led by General Murat, fixed bayonets, marched into the chamber and emptied it. The elected representatives of the French Republic fled through windows into the gardens. A decade of revolutionary democracy ended to the drumbeat of marching boots. That evening, a rump of terrified deputies was rounded up to formally abolish the Directory and appoint 3 provisional consuls to rule. Size, another director, and Napoleon Bonaparte. Everyone knew who held the real power. Size believed his moment had come to implement his complex constitution. Napoleon thanked him for his draft, then rewrote it entirely. The resulting constitution of the year 8 was a masterpiece of disguised autocracy. It established a government called the consulate. There were 3 consuls, but the second and third were mere advisors. All real executive power was vested in the first consul, and the constitution named Napoleon Bonaparte to that post for 10 years. The legislature was a confusing, weak shadow, designed to be powerless. The people's consent was secured through a plebiscite, a direct yes or no vote. The results, likely manipulated by Napoleon's brother, showed overwhelming approval. The French people, desperate for stability, willingly traded political liberty for the promise of peace, order, and an end to revolution. As first consul, Napoleon moved with astounding energy. His first task was to end the war. In a daring march over the Alps through the Great St. Bernard Pass, he surprised the Austrian army in Italy. On June 14, 1800, at the Battle of Marengo, he secured a dramatic victory that forced Austria to sue for peace. By 1802, he had negotiated peace with Britain as well. For the first time in a decade, Europe was quiet. At home, he worked to heal the nation's wounds. He offered amnesty to émigré nobles, bringing thousands back to France if they swore loyalty. His most brilliant act of reconciliation was the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII. This agreement ended the decade-long religious war. The Pope recognized the French Republic and accepted the loss of church lands. In return, Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the majority, with clergy paid by the state but appointed by the government. It pacified the devout countryside and brought the church firmly under state control. But Napoleon's most enduring legacy was not on the battlefield or in the cathedral. It was in the law library. He spearheaded the creation of a single, unified legal code for all of France, the Napoleonic Code. Before the Revolution, France was a patchwork of hundreds of conflicting local laws. Napoleon wanted clarity, order, and unity. He presided over more than half the drafting sessions himself, demanding simple, unambiguous language. Promulgated in 1804, the code was a monumental synthesis. It permanently cemented the core revolutionary principles of equality before the law, freedom of conscience, and the absolute right to private property. It abolished the last remnants of feudalism and guaranteed careers open to talent. It was the legal bedrock for modern, bourgeois France. Yet it was also deeply conservative. It rolled back revolutionary gains for women, placing them under the absolute authority of their husbands, restricting their property rights and grounds for divorce. A husband owes protection to his wife, a wife obedience to her husband, it stated. In its vision of the patriarchal family, it looked backward to Rome, not forward to liberty for all. The code's influence was global. Carried by Napoleon's armies across Europe, it swept away medieval legal systems from Italy to the Netherlands. Its clarity and logic made it a model for dozens of nations worldwide, from Latin America to Japan. The revolution's most successful export was not the guillotine, but this tome of civil law. By 1802, Napoleon's power was supreme. Using a royalist assassination plot as a pretext, he held another plebiscite to make himself first consul for life. The Republic was now a monarchy in all but name. The final transformation came in 1804. After another conspiracy, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping and execution of a young Bourbon prince, the Duc d'Enghien, in a blatant act of state murder. It sent a message: there could be no return to the old monarchy. The only security lay in him. The Senate petitioned him to accept a new title. On May 18, 1804, a new constitution declared France an empire. Napoleon Bonaparte became Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. He did not choose king, a tainted word. Emperor evoked Charlemagne and ancient Rome, a modern, military, pan-European authority. The coronation was held on December 2, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral. In a moment of breathtaking symbolism, as the Pope waited to crown him, Napoleon took the crown from the pontiff's hands and placed it on his own head. His authority, he declared, came from his own achievements and the will of the people, not from God. The Corsican artillery officer, the child of revolution, was now the equal of any hereditary monarch in Europe. The tumultuous, bloody, world-altering journey that began in the halls of Versailles had ended on an imperial throne. The coronation of Napoleon as emperor in 1804 is, for many, the final curtain on the French Revolution. The chaotic 25-year drama that began with an oath in a dusty tennis court seemed to conclude with the restoration of a hereditary, absolute monarchy. On the surface, it appeared the great struggle for liberty had come full circle, replacing a Bourbon king with a Corsican emperor. But to see it only as a failure is to miss the profound, irreversible transformation. Napoleon's empire was not the ancien regime. The old world of legal privilege and divine right monarchy had been shattered beyond repair. The revolution's complex legacy, a tapestry of brilliant ideals and dark warnings, was already woven into the fabric of the modern world. The most immediate legacy was the utter destruction of the feudal order in France. The intricate pyramid of the three estates, its tax-exempt nobles and powerful clergy, was gone forever. The Napoleonic Code legally enshrined a new society based on equality before the law. A man's position was now determined by talent and property, not birthright. This was the great, enduring triumph of the bourgeoisie, the class that had both ignited and ultimately stabilized the revolution. They secured a world where property was sacred, careers were open to merit, and a uniform legal system supported the rise of modern capitalism. The revolution also gave birth to modern politics itself. It was in the heated debates of the National Assembly that the terms left and right were born, based on the seeding of radicals and conservatives. This era was a crucible for ideologies. It defined modern liberalism with its focus on individual rights and constitutional government. It sparked modern conservatism in reaction to its upheavals, and it forged a powerful tradition of revolutionary radicalism, the belief that society could be rationally remade from the ground up. The explosion of political clubs, newspapers, and public debate created a new public sphere, where the nation's affairs became the business of every citizen. At the heart of this new political culture was the explosive idea of popular sovereignty, the belief that all legitimate authority flows from the people, not from God or dynasty. This single concept would topple empires and found nations for centuries to come. Flowing from this was the awakening of modern nationalism. Before 1789, a peasant in Provence and a merchant in Paris shared little beyond obedience to the same distant king. The revolution forged them into a single nation. Being French became a powerful, emotional identity, forged in the fire of foreign invasion and the rallying cry of La Patrie, the fatherland. The levée en masse, the national draft, and anthems like the Marseillaise created a bond of shared sacrifice and destiny. This potent, often dangerous force of a people in arms, fighting for their nation rather than their king, became one of the revolution's most powerful and enduring exports. Of course, the legacy is a dual one, a story of light and profound shadow. Its bright, guiding beacon is the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. Its proclamation of universal rights to liberty, property, and security became the foundational text for liberal democracy worldwide. Every subsequent struggle for human dignity, from the abolition of slavery to the fight for gender equality, owes a debt to those principles articulated in 1789. But this legacy is forever shadowed by the dark model of the Reign of Terror. The Terror provided a chilling new blueprint for modern state power. It demonstrated how a small, determined group of ideologues could seize control of a centralized state and use its machinery, surveillance, ideological purges, show trials, and systematic violence to impose a utopian vision on society. The Committee of Public Safety was a grim prelude to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. The revolution thus left the world with a terrifying, unresolved question: how does a society achieve profound change without descending into a moral abyss? How does it defend liberty without sacrificing liberty itself? This complex inheritance was carried across Europe at the point of a bayonet. Napoleon's armies were both conquerors and unwitting missionaries. They brought the Napoleonic Code, the abolition of feudalism, and the principles of legal equality, sweeping away medieval cobwebs from Germany to Italy. They inspired liberal and nationalist movements wherever they marched, even as they imposed French domination. The revolution's echo was heard in the slave revolt of Saint-Domingue, which became the independent nation of Haiti, and in the Latin American independence movements led by figures like Simón Bolívar. The French Revolution was not a French event, it was a world historical quake, the fault line between the early modern and the modern age. As our journey through this tumultuous period draws to a close, we have traveled from sun-drenched halls of mirrors to torchlit streets of insurrection. We have stood with idealists in a tennis court and witnessed the cold, mechanical fall of the guillotine. We have seen the birth of sublime hopes and their descent into unimaginable horror, and followed a lone, ambitious figure as he climbed from obscurity to an imperial throne. And so, the great will turns to a stop. The fever breaks. The echoes of cannon fire at Valmy, the shouts from the scaffold, the solemn oaths in the tennis court, they fade into the quiet of history. We find ourselves returned to our own time, to the silence of your room, the soft weight of your blanket. The French Revolution, that vast and terrible dream, is over. But before we part, let us listen for its whispers in our modern world, for the revolution did not end with Napoleon's crown. It simply dissolved into the bloodstream of modernity, and we are all its inheritors. Its most universal legacy resonates in 3 words: liberty, equality, fraternity. This was more than a slogan. It was a political equation humanity is still struggling to solve. The tension between these ideals defines our politics to this day. Liberty, the great cry of 1789, echoes in every constitution, in every court defending free speech, in every protest for individual rights. The liberal tradition that guards the individual against the overreach of the state is a direct child of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Equality, the driving force of the radical Jacobins, proved more complex. The revolution achieved legal equality, but its push for social and economic equality was defeated. Yet that defeated dream never died. It became the core inspiration for the socialist and communist movements of the following centuries. Our ongoing debates about wealth, poverty, and the role of government in creating a fairer society are a direct continuation of the argument between the moderate Girondins and the radical Mountain. Fraternity, the call for brotherhood, became the emotional engine of modern nationalism. It was the glue that bound citizens to defend la patrie. But this powerful love for one's own can curdle, as we know too well, into suspicion of the other. The aggressive, expansionist nationalisms that led to the catastrophes of the 20th century are a dark offspring of this revolutionary bond. The revolution also left a blueprint, a tragic script for all future revolutions. It became the archetype. Karl Marx analyzed its class struggles. The Russian Bolsheviks of 1917 studied it obsessively, seeing themselves as Jacobins who would avoid the mistake of Thermidor. Revolutionaries from China to Cuba have consciously walked the stages they first saw in France. The moderate beginning, the radical turn, the terror, the military consolidation. The story became a pattern, a warning, and a guide. Even now, the whispers of this upheaval are in the air around you. They are in the very language of our politics, left and right, human rights, national sovereignty. They are present in our global struggle to build stable democracies, and in our daily debates over the balance between freedom and security, the individual and the collective. The story of the French Revolution is, in the end, a timeless and cautionary tale. It reminds us that the desire for a better world is one of the most powerful forces in human history. But it also shows, with brutal clarity, that the path from an old, unjust order to a new one is a narrow ledge over an abyss. It teaches us that the purest ideals can be twisted into instruments of oppression, and that the line between a republic of virtue and a reign of terror can be vanishingly thin. It is a story of courage and cowardice, of brilliant vision and blinding hubris, of sacrifices that saved a nation and crimes that forever stained its soul. It tells us that history is not made by impersonal forces, but by the choices of individuals, made in moments of tremendous fear and soaring hope. As we end our story, perhaps it is best to return to that single, iconic image from its very beginning. The deputies in the tennis court, their arms outstretched, swearing their oath to build a new world. Look at their faces, frozen in that moment. They are filled with hope, determination, and a profound uncertainty about the future they are about to unleash. They could not know the glory or the horror to come. They only knew the world they had inherited was broken, and they had the duty to begin it anew. From the Sleepy Owl family to you, wherever you are listening, we thank you for sharing this long journey into the past. May the lessons of this story, of their courage and their failings, settle gently upon you. May the quiet that follows history's storm bring you a deep and restorative peace. Let the tides of time wash away today's worries, leaving only the calm shore of sleep. If this journey has helped you find a moment of rest, we would be honored to have you follow along for more. There are many more stories in the archives of the night waiting to be gently told. For now, close your eyes. Let the echoes of revolution fade into the peaceful silence of your own breath. The past has had its say. Now it is time for your dreams. Good night.